Good evening, everyone. I am very much delighted to welcome you all for the third School of Engineering lecture series. Your participation in this lecture series will motivate us to do better in our future endeavors. This lecture series has been started with the motivation to promote a conducive academic and research environment in our school. This lecture series also aims to promote a collaborative research environment within our school. It will also helpful for the participants, especially students, to know the research activities which are being carried out in our school so that they can be a part of any research team in order to pursue their research goals. Okay, now I will take this opportunity to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Gaurav Bhutani. He is an assistant professor in this School of Engineering, works in the area of multi-phase flows, computational fluid dynamics, and associated areas. And our second speaker is Ms. Divya Verma, PhD scholar in the School of Engineering. She works in the area of nanomaterials. Okay, now I will just give you the format of this talk. The format of this talk is as follows. The first presentation is by Dr. Gaurav Bhutani, 25 minutes for presentation and 5 minutes for discussion. And the second presentation is by Divya Verma, 15 minutes for presentation and 5 minutes for discussion. Okay. Now I request Dr. Gaurav Bhutani to start his presentation. Dr. Gaurav Bhutani.
Thank you very much, Tala. Do you want my video to be on during the presentation?
I think it is not required.
Okay. Then
during question answer, maybe we have the video. Yeah.
So video off. Let me share my slides as well. Is my slide visible?
Yes.
Okay, in the full screen mode, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Right. So thank you very much for attending this talk. I'm delighted to have all of you here. The topic today is a very non-typical topic for a seminar talk. It's called the developmental life cycle of a computational mechanics package. So I thought I'll put my experiences into this seminar and probably motivate or seek interest in this kind of a problem. So to demonstrate what the ideas I'll be delivering, I'd be using 3 case studies, and all these case studies are from applications of granular flows. So the first one I'll take is called a lean granular flow problem. So this will have very few number of particles which are interacting with each other and resulting in some sort of flow of particles. This lean granular flow problem is a C-based code that we have developed from scratch in our group. The second problem will be for a more dense granular flow, which will have tremendous amount of particles. And the application we are looking for in this case is, for example, snow avalanches. So when an avalanche happens with the snow and ice particles, then you're talking about of the order of 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 8 particles, or even more. So for this problem, we have modified an existing Fortran-based open source package. And the third one I'll be presenting is for polydisperse flows. So again, this is granular flows, but we are interested more in how the particle size distribution evolves as the flow phenomena happens. We are having aggregation of particles and breakage of particles. And this problem is solved using a Python-based solver that again has been developed from scratch. And in case you have any questions, please feel free to stop me and ask, in case the questions are about clarification. But if they are more about some ideas, then we can discuss them towards the end. Right. So the first thing in any software problem or any modeling problem is to choose what sort of model we are going to use. Okay, so the first step is typically what sort of output are we expecting? An example would be, are we expecting for an avalanche, how fast the avalanche front is traveling, so that once an avalanche happens on the top of a mountain, how long will it take for that avalanche front to reach the civilization? Or is the expected modeling output, I mean, how much of a force, shear force is the avalanche causing, and how much of an erosion is avalanche creating? The other sort of expected outcome could be what sort of particle distribution is evolving. So as an avalanche moves, or as granular particles move as a whole, they will collide with each other, they'll aggregate, they will break. So the particle distribution, size distribution will change. So sometimes you're interested more in the particle size distribution than the fluid dynamics of it. So then we'll have to choose a different kind of model depending on the model output. Again, the second modeling choice is what sort of modeling regime we want to work with. Is it a continuum modeling regime? For example, if we have lots and lots of particles in a small amount of volume, then it seems that the continuum regime will be applicable. But if we have only a few number of particles which once in a while will interact with the other particles, we may want to work with more like a discrete regime, or in some cases we'll have both of them, and then we'll have interaction between the two as well. The next is number of phases. So if we have a multi-phase problem, for example, a slurry flow, you have a liquid in a mining industry or a process industry, you'll have water or some surfactants mixed with particles which are mineral particles. Then you have multiple phases. So we may want to choose a multi-phase solver or develop a multi-phase solver as compared to a single phase solver, which data structures wise become a big problem if you want to expand from a single phase to a multi-phase. So in that case, you may want to go with some existing solver and modify it. The next thing is if you're choosing between an existing solver and developing a new solver, then you must remember are the features that you're expecting available or not. So in our case, we were looking for non-Newtonian modeling, nonlinear fluids, but that feature was not available in the solver that we wanted to use. But it had some other features which are really nice. I'll talk about them in terms of the optimized solvers that we are using. So we thought of implementing a new feature in an existing solver rather than developing a new solver from scratch, because it's only one feature that was missing. Everything else was amazing in that. The other is tractability. So there may be lots of solvers available, but if you think of from a practical point of view, then it may take forever for a given solver to solve the problem. So they may still be using legacy mathematical or computational methods, which nowadays have been superseded by very novel computational techniques. So in that case, we may want to either develop a new solver and develop linear solvers, for example, from scratch. So that again depends on, just the solver being available is not the complete picture. It should be able to solve the problem also in a given amount of time. And the last thing we typically look for in a modeling choice is what sort of, are we looking at an open source code, or are we looking at a canned software that we can buy from the market or from off the shelf? Again, it depends on how much money we have available with us. If we have a big grant, then we definitely can go for a canned software, but it may happen that that software may not allow you to implement new features as required later. So if you're looking at a 10-year development, then it may be worth to spend some amount of time in developing an open source code, either from scratch or modifying an existing code that you like. Okay, so this is the first problem that I'll talk about, the lean granular flows. I'm sure this video is available. So this animation is created from the solver that has been developed by a master student in our group from scratch. So in this case, we're talking about single phase. So we only have one phase in the sense of we only have circular particles in the flow, but these particles can be of different sizes. So in this case, different sizes are shown using different colors. Okay, the application we are looking for here is granular collapse. So there are many problems where particle column collapses. For example, you have a cliff erosion. So a cliff breaks and it shatters and falls into, breaks into lots of particles. So in this case, we are particularly interested in how the particles break. And we do have a lot of discrete element method software available, software is available, but they do not have the kind of breakage model that we wanted to implement. And implementing this breakage model in an existing solver was much more work as compared to developing one from scratch based on the understanding we had. So the student had a good understanding of programming as well as physics. So we thought, why not implement this from scratch? And this has been a success. I'll show you the results very soon. The next problem is a dense granular flow problem. So this is flow problem of an avalanche flow. So on the right hand side, you see a picture of, you may have recognized that. That's the Griffin Mountain. And we hypothetically took this case. So if an avalanche happens on Griffin Mountain, then what sort of dynamics will it show? So we're just waiting for that day when everything gets covered with snow and we'll have an avalanche here. So we'll be able to validate our models. But I hope that doesn't happen. The applications, in this case, the modeling method we are using is Eulerian because we're talking about lots and lots of particles. So we decided to use a continuum regime where we can use the ideas of continuum mechanics. So to develop the mass and momentum balance and energy balance equations and solve them using and get predict them using piecewise linear polynomials or piecewise quadratic polynomials rather than solving for the position and velocity of each and every particle that is flowing in that flow. Okay, in this case, as I said, we are interested more in the non-Newtonian regime, the non-linear nature of snow as it flows. So we decided to implement a new feature of adding non-linearity or implementing non-Newtonian flow in an existing solver, which otherwise is quite nice. And the third one is for polydispersed flows. In this case, we are more interested in how the particle size distribution evolves as the flow happens. As the particles aggregate, break, they grow, they spread in the phase space. We're interested more in that rather than what sort of dynamics it creates. So in this case, we again chose the Eulerian way because we're not interested in each and every position of each and every particle, but we are more interested in the bulk behavior as a distribution. So in this case, we particularly went for a different kind of an approach. We chose Python as a programming language. And I'll discuss why that was the choice, despite the fact that Python can be quite slow in general. Okay, so this is the first step again. Once you have made those choices, is to choose the mathematical model. I didn't prepare the slide in completion because I didn't want to put all the equations here. But typically, you go to the whiteboard here at this step. You list out all the inputs required and the outputs, and what sort of model you will be having to connect those inputs to the outputs. It could be Newton's laws of motion for a simple force equals mass times acceleration for each and every particle, or it could be more like a continuum approach where you have a control volume approach. Or for the polydispersed case problem, you would be using more of a Boltzmann equation. So the next step is discretization methods. So you would want to, if you are dealing with problems such as the continuum flow problems, where you have these Navier-Stokes equations, you'll want to convert that to discrete equations because computers can only add and multiply numbers. They cannot solve differential equations straight away. So that's the next step. And in case you're working with granular flows where you're dealing with the forces acting on particles, you'll want to integrate dv by dt equals the acceleration, which is equal to force equals mass times acceleration. So you'll want to integrate those equations to calculate the position and velocity at the next time step. Okay, I don't want to discuss those equations because the main aim here is to talk about the computational perspective. Another step which is very important, which many people ignore, is the choice of a computational solver. In most cases, for partial differential equation or differential equations, we end up getting linear equations, a system of linear equations. And in most cases, we choose the most easiest one that we can pick from a textbook and then proceed with that software development. And what happens is, while we are implementing more advanced features, we never revisit this until our problems start taking a tremendous amount of time, and we start losing the motivation. The student will start losing the motivation to run problems. A problem which is taking 20 days on a workstation will in some way kill the motivation. But if at the beginning we had spent some time and chosen the most effective solver, then we could be solving that 20-day problem in only 2 hours. Okay, that's the amount of progress that has happened in the development of linear algebra solvers in the last many decades. Okay, so there, I've not shown that here, but we have seen exponential increase in the methods available for solving linear algebra problems, in addition to the computational advancement as well. Okay, so it's worth spending that effort here. And then, as I told you that we have chosen Python for solving that third problem. And the reason is because with Python, we developed a code both in Python and a traditional Fortran code for polydispersed flows. And the Python one is literally, it took a couple of days to implement, whereas the Fortran one took months. And the number of lines, if you see, you can literally read that code and understand. If you understand the method, you can understand the code in a few hours. But the Fortran code will require many months for you to understand, because it is a very intricate amount of coding there. For the same problem, Python can work really effectively. So if you're looking at implementing, adding new features, and you have a student who's only going to work for a year, then there's a lot of learning that can happen, a lot of contribution for testing new features. If that feature really works, if those ideas work, then time can be spent to modify that Fortran version of the code. But for testing many ideas, it's not worth using a Fortran code, because the development and the learning cycle is just quite steep in Fortran as compared to Python. And nowadays, with the new wrappers, etc., available, Python can also be quite quick. As quick as in some cases to C and Fortran. Right. So the next step is we have to see how things are going. So typically, a computational mechanics problem or a new solver requires 3 different steps of testing. So the first one is called verification, where you test if your implementation is correct. Okay, this is for correctness of solving mathematical equations. I may have made a mistake, let's say, in writing a 2 times and probably wrote as 1/2 times. So that changes the answer. So that's that kind of an error will be picked at verification step. The next is validation, where you test the model validity. So if I've used, let's say, a non-Newtonian flow model for predicting the flow of an avalanche, that model could be, that's not the correct model, or that's not the best model that I've chosen. So that correctness of the choice of model is tested using at the validation stage, where you compare the results with some experimental result or field study. And the last one is benchmarking, where you compare your package, your code with the results of some other code that's available in the market. Okay, so that's just to see where you stand in the market. Is your solver 10 times more efficient doing this with the same accuracy or with a minor loss in accuracy, or it's 10 times slower? So why would what's the, that tells us whether we are doing things the most up-to-date way or not. Okay, so code verification, as I said, you compare with analytical solution for different cases. So for this, you test part by part rather than solving for the whole equation, because in many cases, the whole equation, the solution for the whole equation is not available in a closed form mathematically. So in fluid mechanics, for example, we go for a problem where you have a Poiseuille flow problem. So flow in a pipe, a laminar flow in a pipe. We have these solution available for that in a closed analytical form. So we can compare the analytical solution with the numerical solution that we are predicting. And we can also see in this case how accurate the solution is. So typically computational methods will have some error, the order of error, depending on the method that we are using for solving the equations, computational methods. So is the order of accuracy what we expect? So we can do that. We can increase the number of degrees of freedom and then see if the error is falling down with the same order or not. So this can be tested here because we know the exact solution to the problem at this stage. Okay, the last point here is MMS. It's called the method of manufactured solutions. It's a very neat technique where in many cases you don't have the solution available to a given problem. Okay, analytical solution. So what you can do is you can manufacture a solution. You can think of some sort of mathematically feasible solution. You can put it in the equation, and if the equation does not satisfy the solution, it will generate some extra source term, and that source term can be added. So you can modify the actual equation in terms of adding a source term and then solve it, and then now you have a solution, an analytical solution available that you can compare with. So here I will not go into details of how the method works. I simply want to introduce you these ideas so that in case one is interested, they can pick these up. So here's a verification result from our granular column collapse problem. So here you can see that we have compared 2 different numerical methods. One's a linear, one's a non-linear method. And on the y-axis, we have the log of the error. Okay, and on the x-axis we have time steps. So we can see that the error is increasing as the number of time steps increase because it's adding on, but it's still within an acceptable range. And we also see from here is that the non-linear method is much accurate as compared to the linear method that is expected. So it's a verification stage, and we can see that errors are growing as expected. This one's verification for the avalanche flow code that I talked about. So here again we used a Poiseuille flow problem. Flow between this is a Couette flow problem. This is a Poiseuille flow problem. So both the plates are stationary and we have a pressure difference that is driving the flow. And for the non-Newtonian case, this is the kind of profile we see. So we've plotted both numerical and analytical solution on the left hand side. On the right hand side, we have calculated the error, which is numerical solution minus analytical solution, and we have shown how that error grows with mesh size. It's a log-log plot, and we can see that as expected. For example, this P1, which is a linear polynomial, it gives a linear order of convergence, as you can see from this green dashed line, which is a typical, which is showing a benchmark for order delta x. So we see that our methods are behaving numerically as expected. Next, third one is the benchmarking for Python. Again, you can't even see the analytical solution here because they are exactly overlapping. All of the methods were tested. The next thing is unit tests. So in many cases, we want to have, when we develop a software, slowly people will start adding features to it. So we want to make sure that we have some standard tests available, and these tests are automated in the sense that whenever somebody wants to implement a new feature, they have to make sure all the previous tests are working. Okay, if not, if some previous test has failed, that means that I have broken some feature that was working earlier. And this idea of having test harnesses or nose tests is quite standard for software. So one should definitely keep that in mind when implementing verification problems. The next step is validation. So as I told you, you have to compare results, experimental results, to the model that we have chosen. The experimental results could be coming from papers. You could do your own experiments, and depending on what is feasible. So here I show for the avalanche flow solver. On the top, you see, is my mouse visible? Just checking quickly. I'm moving around the mouse. Just want to make sure it's visible.
Yes.
Yeah, it's visible.
Perfect. So you see, this is a snow chute. So this was actually an experiment that was done by someone else, where snow is flowing in a chute, where the incline is changing as the snow flows around. On the right hand side, we have compared the experimental results with our numerical results, and the results were quite acceptable. At the bottom, you have the same non-Newtonian problem, but more controlled. In this case, we have shampoo in a small bench section. On the right hand side, this time, instead of showing just how fast the column is moving when it collapses, we have shown the actual interface, and you can also see the interface is matching quite well. Okay, so this gives us some confidence as to the choice of models, if they're correct for the given fluid or not. Last step is benchmarking. So again, in this case, we compare our work with somebody else's solver, and just to show that we also are in the same at the same level in the market in terms of solvers. Right. So let's quickly come to optimization. The spelling's wrong here, but the first step in any optimization in terms of program optimization is compiler optimization. And I'm amazed when many people are actually not aware of these kind of features. So typically, what we've done here is you see this -O2. So GCC is a compiler that's an open GNU compiler for C. And what we have done is we have simply added a -O2 command here, and then we see what happens to the time the program takes to run. So this blue bar is without optimization. So this -O2 was not present. That's how we typically compile a code. It took around 13.5 seconds. Whereas with different levels of optimization, we saw that the runtime reduced by literally 4 times. Okay, so you can see that I had no knowledge of this code, but I simply added this optimization flag -O2, and this is what happened. Okay, so this is a very quick optimization one can do. So this was for, again, that granular collapse model that I showed you. It had 50 particles collapsing, and a total of 500,000 time steps were there. So we are solving the velocity and acceleration for a total of 500,000 time steps. So we saw a total of 4 times time saving in general. Okay, so we tried for different number of particles and different number of time steps. So on an average, we are getting between 3.8 to 4.2 times. So we got a 4 times saving with second order optimization. Okay, that's all we did. Okay, so what happens in this compiler optimization? So under the hood, lots of interesting things happen. So the compiler will probably reorder the loops depending on how the memory is organized inside the computer. It may perform multiplication outside the loop. So it may reduce the number of total floating point operations you will be requiring, which you don't care about when writing a typical code. It may pipeline operations more effectively. So typically the way computer works is it gathers instructions into its registers. It will fetch some data from the memory through different caches into the register. And register is where the CPU can work. Okay, and this is not possible with interpreted languages like Python or MATLAB, because in an interpreted language, the computer does not know it is going to come ahead. But for a compiled language, it sees the program as a whole, and it can reorder things, or it can plan for action even before it's happened, because it knows what will happen next. The whole code was given to it to compile in the beginning. But be careful when using these, because sometimes they can end up doing things which you don't expect. Okay, so one has to be very careful before one starts optimizing the code. Okay, this is a typical memory hierarchy. So as I told you that typically in a computer you have different levels of memory. You have traditional mechanical hard drive, then you have an SSD, which is a bit faster than the mechanical hard drives, then you have the RAM, which is much faster. Then there are 3 different levels of cache memories. You have the register, and then you have the CPU that works on the register. Okay, typically when we are shopping for hardware, we don't care about the cache and the registers. But if you're into heavy duty computing, it's worth spending some time understanding this. And you may get the same clock speed or cycle gigahertz of a processor, but it may have a higher cache, which could do tremendous help to the runtime. I won't go here. It's pipelining.
Dr. Gaurav, I request you please conclude now.
Okay. So I'll quickly browse through it.
Yes. Yeah,
good. So this is some ideas of effective coding strategies. So we can use we can code more effectively to make sure that things can run much faster. I'll quickly show the results. So next is code parallelization. So typically when you want to parallelize code, you have to do some profiling. So in this case, we did the profiling, and we saw that one particular function was taking 95% of the time. So one has to figure out what part of the code is taking a lot of time before prematurely parallelizing the whole code. So here we saw the order of the algorithm. So we saw that it was something like an exponential algorithm. We figured out what kind of parallelizations are available, and we chose OpenMP because that's can be implemented quickly. We did that, and then we saw that on the x-axis you have 1, 2, and 4 cores. So we saw that as we increase the number of cores, our runtimes fell down drastically. So parallelization was much of a lot of use, and this is only a 30 grand computer we're talking about. Okay, we did some scaling. If we increase the number of particles, what happens to the runtime? So again, a code parallelization can be done very quickly without spending too much effort learning how it is done. The next kind of optimization, the last kind I'll talk about, is mesh adaptivity. So sometimes you would want to adapt the mesh, okay, with using the same amount of computational resources, but change how the problem is being solved. And then again, we can see adaptive meshes can be as accurate as fine meshes, but they can be tremendously quick. Okay, I'll skip these geometry and meshing ideas, but I'll just talk about some ideas worth considering. Okay, many people are not aware of ideas like virtual machines and containers, and we use them on the HPC cluster at IIT Mandi as well. So nowadays, nobody installs software from scratch. Okay, these software are installed on standard containers, which are just files, and you can just copy files from a computer to computer, and the software will run. And it is almost as fast as the bare metal installation. So it's most of the people are using containers nowadays rather than spending time, because students have to learn how to install lots of libraries on a Linux machine, which wastes time in many cases. And the last thing I'll talk about is cloud computing here. So cloud computing is getting very popular, and again, with the availability of containers, you literally have to log in, pay by the second, run a code, and the code will run on, for example, Amazon Web Services when there's not much load. So you'll have to pay only a couple of paise per second, and then you can do interesting computing there rather than buying your own workstation, because your workstation will get outdated in 2 years. but the hardware they provide will be always up to date. So it's worth considering if the grant allows to spend resources on cloud computing with a simple workstation rather than buying clusters. Yes, I'll stop here, and thank you very much for the patience, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav, for a very nice presentation. Now, floor is open for the questions. If you have any questions, need clarification. Yes.
Sir, in the slide you mentioned compiled Python. Sir, can you elaborate it?
Right.
Yeah, optimization. You said interpreter interpreter languages can't be used for optimization.
Right. So nowadays, thanks. So nowadays it is possible. You have some. I mean, there have been projects where you can compile a Python code, and of course you have to give the code as a whole script beforehand. It can't figure out how it works, but there are a few projects available now. They are all test projects, but I mean they're worth considering. So people are spending lots of time developing compilers for Python. So all I can say right now is it is possible. I personally have not used them, but I'm simply aware that they are available.
And sir, at there we can apply this optimization.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a compiler available, then definitely these options will be provided, because the whole job of an interesting compiler is to help you write in a high-level language, but it will take care of what's happening at the architecture scale. And again, adding to this point, it is sometimes worth spending resources in buying a compiler. So, for example, if you're using a cluster which uses a workstation which uses Intel architecture, Intel processor, and a motherboard, then the Intel Fortran or Intel C compilers will be in many cases, quite faster as compared to the open source GNU compilers, because open source compilers are built for generality, whereas Intel compilers are built for Intel architecture, so they'll be quicker. So if that is what you're requiring, if it helps, then it's worth spending that extra time, extra money.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other wants to ask anything? Dr. Gaurav, I have one small thing I want to ask, that what kind of major challenges one have to face when using the open source than developing own code?
Well, if one has in the past developed their own code, then it's very frustrating to look at anybody else's code, even though it's been well commented and all, because it's not you who's written it. So there is a lot of frustration trying to understand what they're trying to do. And an open source code will, in most cases, never provide you with that level of documentation as a canned software will provide, because people are heavily paid for developing documentation for canned software for their features of interest. There may be many features which are not documented at all. But with open source, this kind of frustration is always there, because you have to spend a lot of time trying to understand what exactly they are doing. And in some cases, you don't like the way they are doing things, but there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to live with that. So it's like adjusting in a new relationship. You just have to give it some time, learn from it, and then once the things start making sense, it becomes a lot more fun.
Thank you. But I think it's better to make your own code to avoid this frustration.
I mean, if you have the resources available, then there's nothing better than that. I mean, developing a new code, even if there's a 5-year timeline for developing a code, I mean, many people get trained in the process, and in the end, we get what we were expecting. So if you want to make a change, for example, a new linear solver is available, that implementation is much quicker than doing it for an open source code, because they may end up changing it completely, and then we are at trouble again, because now we have to understand the new feature that they have now implemented, which we're not aware of. I always recommend doing that if possible.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Yeah, along the same lines, Gaurav. So, like sometimes there are some softwares which may even be open source, but let's say they have GUI to it, or so sometimes the way they are written, it's very complicated to decrypt it or understand it, and adding a feature. So how, because many times these are probably written in some other formats or DLL or some. So you want to say something on that?
Yeah, so if the libraries are available, then you will be able, if the code is available, you will be able to read the code and make changes. But I understand what you're saying. So sometimes they will refer to some other compiled code. So it's DLLR,
Yes,
you link to those libraries. You don't know how the DLL is working itself. So it could be
exactly.
one of those linear solvers, which is doing something very efficiently, but it does not tell you. It just tells you, you give this input, it will give you this kind of an output. So, I mean,
Yeah,
if
exactly. For
DLL
example, like you said about different types of solvers. So many times I try to go into the solvers and try to see, try to get into the softwares to see where actually these solvers are, like BLAS or on these types of softwares, but just could not find or figure it out where these piece of code is written. Yeah.
as far as I've also done the same thing. I've never looked into BLAS codes, because the expectation is that if there is a good solver available, that's available in BLAS. So they keep updating these linear algebra solvers. But LAPACK does that. But I think that they do make things open source. I'll go through it. I think we are planning to work on a project, so I'll definitely go through it and let you know. But as far as I am aware, the code is available for these kind of libraries. So one has to just find them. But in many cases, you won't find the code because people are simply working with the pre-compiled libraries. There's a link to it.
Okay. So I think does it require a very deep knowledge on C, C++ to work with these Ling libraries?
If you just want to use the library as it is, no. It's just it's basically a function call that you have to make. You just have to make sure that you provide the matrices in the same format as they're expecting. So sometimes it's a sparse matrix, so you have to provide it in the same format. Rather than storing all the elements, it will just store where the elements are and what the element values are. If you do that, then everything else is straightforward. It's simply like a Python call. Even Python can do that. Access, it has ways to use BLAS. But if you want to understand how BLAS works, my understanding would be that it would be complicated, because there's plenty of very advanced parallelized solvers that have been developed. Again, it depends on the understanding. My understanding of advanced linear algebra methods is not that amazing, but somebody who has an understanding may probably be able to understand. But there is plenty of developmental work that has gone into, and it goes regularly into these kind of solvers.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav, for a very nice presentation.
May I share my experience? I'm Pradeep.